Hello, thanks, Jessica. So my name is Larissa Gil Sanhueza, and I am Senior Manager of the Young Adult Program. It's great to be here with everyone tonight, and also I'll let her introduce herself in one moment. We are joined by one of our former Advocacy Corps organizers, Kiana Folk, who worked with us from August 2021 through May 2022 on building support for the Environmental Justice for All Act, right? That is the bill that we'll be working on at QPPI. And Kiana actually lobbied on this for 10 months and organized her community. And this cohort of organizers that lobbied on this issue, you'll meet some of them at the event. They actually lobbied a total of 89 times, and we counted 306 people in those visits. So really, we've been working on this issue for a while now, and we've built a really good base of support, but we need to keep building that base of support, right? And it'll be great to get everyone thinking about their stories. So I will let Kiana introduce herself quickly. Kiana, if you just want to give your name again, where you're calling from, where you organize, and what your role is now.
All right. Hello, I'm Kiana Folk. I'm from Maryland. As Larissa said, I was part of Advocacy Corps last year, and right now I'm working as an administrative assistant at a law firm representing unions. And well, personally, I hope to get far in maybe furthering my education.
Thank you, Kiana. We are all very delighted to be here with all of you tonight. But before we get started, I would love to hear where all of you are calling us from. So if you can say your name and let us know where you're calling from. You can either unmute yourself or raise your hand using the reaction icon at the bottom of your screen, or you can also use the chat box. So we'll take about 5 of you to unmute yourself and say where you're calling from. Hi, Chris from West Virginia. I see a lot of you are using the chat box. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Los Altos, California, Michael Murphy.
Hi, Michael.
Earl Smith, Barnesville, Ohio.
Hi, Earl.
Margaret Liu, New York City.
Hi, Margaret.
Lois Yellow Thunder, Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Hi, Louis.
Elaine Emmy from Bloomington, Indiana.
Hello. Let's have one more.
Dove John from Seattle, Washington.
Nice to meet all of you. And before we dive into the meat of the agenda today, I will ask you a couple questions just so I can learn more about your advocacy journey. So feel free to raise your hand by using the reaction icon, or just raise your hand the old-fashioned way. So how many of you have shared your story at a lobby visit? Wow, there's a lot of you. That's awesome. I love to see that. And how many of you are going to lobby for the first time at annual meeting? I see a couple. Wow, that is great. I love to see that. Well, thank you everyone for participating. If you have any questions throughout the training, please feel free to use the chat box, and either Larissa and I will pause to answer them, or we will wait at the end of the call to answer any questions that you might have. This training, we're going to go over on how to tell your story at the lobby visit that you will have during annual meeting. However, if you have any particular questions regarding the legislative ask, which is supporting the Environmental Justice for All bill, Larissa and I are not policy experts, so we will do our best to answer any questions that you might have regarding the bill. However, I will encourage you all to check our website and look at the resources that we have there. I will drop the link into the chat so you can take a look. However, if you have specific questions regarding the bill, our lobbyist Clarence will be hosting office hours on November 7th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you would like to attend, I will also add the link to the chat and just make sure that you register to attend that call. So if you have particular questions or you would like to learn more about what the bill entails, I really do strongly encourage all of you to check out our resources and then also attend the call with our lobbyist Clarence. So with that, I will pass it over to Larissa to dive into the important elements of what entails to tell a good story during a lobby visit and go over the legislative ask.
Thank you. Okay, there's also a question in the chat, which Jessica just, if one of us can remember to come back to that at the end, there will be time for questions, but don't want to lose that as people continue to put things in the chat. So I'm actually going to share my screen because we've been saying that we will be asking Congress to support the Environmental Justice for All Act. And so it's important to start this conversation by discussing what is environmental justice. Jessica, can you see this? Okay, great. I'll give everyone a second to look at that, and then I'll read it once out loud for everyone. So environmental justice, this is the definition given to us by the Environmental Protection Agency, right, the EPA. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. That is definitely a mouthful in terms of definition, and I think we can break that down a little bit more. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen in order to do that. We know that climate change impacts all of us in some way, right? But there is a disparate impact on low-income communities and some communities of color. So without centering those who are on the front lines of climate change, our climate policies are going to leave some of us behind and cause more harm to communities that are already feeling a significant impact. So this issue is about making sure that people who are being disproportionately impacted, not just by climate change, but also by climate policy, right? Climate policy not centering these communities will inevitably cause even more harm to those communities, right? Like I said, they will be left behind if environmental justice is not the framework we're using in our climate policy. And so this issue is also about centering community solutions. So ensuring that people have the resources they need to take care of themselves and improve conditions on the ground. There are a lot of people already doing this work on the ground, organizations that are looking at public health issues that are caused by environmental impacts of, development, of putting a power plant in the area, of polluting the water in the area, etc. So one of the things that the Environmental Justice for All Act actually does is kind of direct Congress to give funding to all of these different groups that are already doing this work. And that's just one example, right? There's a lot more that that bill does. But I think it's important to start with a foundation of what is environmental justice? What does this bill kind of have to do with that? Before we dive into what our stories are, okay? And a lot of you have lobbied before, a lot of you have told a story before. So I know that I'm not saying anything new exactly for a lot of you, but stories are really the answer to the question of why we care about this issue.
Larissa, I'm
So,
gonna interrupt you real quick. I think you're sharing your screen.
oh, I am not sharing my screen.
Someone
Oh.
is,
It says Earl Smith is sharing.
Oh, so I think someone shared a whiteboard while we were talking. Interesting.
Yeah, I saw only a whiteboard.
Okay, we've stopped the sharing. Thank you, Jessica. I did not see that. Okay, so can Jessica, you remind me, what was the last thing I was saying? Stories.
we're gonna dive into the elements of the story and what entails.
Okay, perfect. So stories are the power that we bring into our legislative offices, okay? And there are different ways of forming a story and different elements to a story. So for example, we might immediately reflect on how the issue impacts us, right? We might think about a story related to impact. So maybe something has happened to you or a loved one or your community, right? And you might want to tell that story. So a caution for this story is that in general, but specifically, you might ask someone to tell their story of impact, right? You should always ask permission to share someone's story before you do that. And once you do share it, it's really important to only share ideas and not IDs. So really don't give any identifying factors of who this person is, but just kind of what we can learn from their story. And so to give an example of a story kind of related to impact, I'm going to hand it over to Kiana, who will share the story that she kind of developed through her time in the program. Kiana, take it away.
All right, thank you. So a story that I shared and a few others that live in my area in Maryland. So I live close by to Old Ellicott City. For those not aware, it was hit with 2 historical floodings. And those floodings were a result of, well, the fact that its location was built around a hill, on a hill and then along it. So, but it was made worse by the fact that it was all the ground was paved. So so if it was just like trees, soils, and a whole variety of plants, it would have absorbed the water and mitigated like the water. But because it was all roads, it just all the flood water just was swept through the whole town. And as a result, there are a decent number of businesses that ended up not coming back. And maybe even more so, there are now plans there are some buildings in Old Ellicott City that had to be knocked down or make way for infrastructure to mitigate any future floods. So so now there's concern about, like, knock on wood, there's no more floods are going to happen, even especially after this infrastructure put in to mitigate. But can't imagine that there are some people that are nervous of starting business there because of the risk of floods. And that's So that's definitely me and many others that live around there. They are deeply impacted and want more of a voice on how developers like have more limitations, regulations with developers, because in my county, developers have free reign to do whatever they want. And their most popular thing they love to do is build housing without any consideration of how it's going to affect the schools, if there's going to be enough services nearby for the people that are going to move in to like when they move in. And I guess and when it comes to relating to environment, there's the fear of the loss of green space during, with all the dust and CO2 being released from the vehicles and during construction, and then after, in fear of like what's left. Is there going to be anything like trees left to absorb the CO2? So that is my personal story.
Thank you for sharing that, Kiana. So I think you can all hear the impact, right, that Kiana described, of kind of the needs of the community not being centered when developers were making decisions impacting the environment, impacting the conditions of the people living there. But you might be wondering how you can tell a story related to impact, right? Maybe you're not sure how something like this might be happening in your community, or maybe you're not sure about what parts of the city you live in are suffering from, like I said, polluted water or something like that. So you can check out, like Jessica put in the chat, our website, fcnl.org/QPPI, and you'll just scroll all the way to the bottom in order to review some of the EJ screener tools that we have. So I don't recommend doing it right now because we definitely want to keep talking about stories. But as you're continuing to reflect on stories after this until the event, please check out all those resources, and just really highlighting that at the bottom, you can maybe determine what some of that impact might look like in your community if you don't already know. However, that is not the only way to tell a story. Impact is not the only way to do that. We also have stories that are related to values and identity. So if it's not about impact, you can speak to what values kind of lead you to care for environmental justice, or maybe some piece of your identity that leads you to care for environmental justice. And when I say identity, I mean maybe you are a person of faith, or depending on the issue, maybe being a student is an identity that lends itself to caring about the issue, right? Or you know, the role you play in your family. I am an oldest sibling. I talked about that once in the story. So that's what I mean by identity. Person of color, for example. So unfortunately, the original author of the story that we're going to share is not able to join us, but she did give us permission to share. And she was also someone that worked with us on this issue. I will hand it to Jessica to read this story. And this one is related to values and identity.
So this is Liana's story. Growing up in Pennsylvania, Congressional District 7, I was so excited to drive. Some of my favorite moments have happened there. Long conversations with family, singing with my best friend as the windows are letting out our screams, deciding where to go to school. But these moments are defined by my access to clean air, effective infrastructure, and privilege of learning to drive. Just as driving is pivotal to my sense of safety, agency, and autonomy, environmental wellness is too. Not only direct consequences of pollution, such as clean air, clean water, impact us, but also legislative proposals, such as pathways to citizenship, financial assistance for environmental remediation, and globalized education are pivotal in our community's safety, agency, and autonomy. This is why we need to pass the Environmental Justice for All bill, so everyone has equitable access to clean air.
Thanks for reading that, Jessica. So I think, I can't speak for how this person started their own reflection, right? But if you're thinking about how you can sort of form your own story related to values, we heard the value of equitable access to clean air, right? We heard the value of effective infrastructure. So having all of these priorities, kind of, maybe I can call them that as well, for this organizer, and having them come out in this story, she's not necessarily saying that something has impacted her in the way that Kiana is saying about her community, right? But still giving an effective story. So if you want a starting point, you might think about, what does a world with environmental justice look like? What hopes do you have? Right? Is it that everyone has access to clean air? Is it that no one is drinking dirty water, right? There's so many ways to frame a story like that. So think about a world with environmental justice, and what does that look like? So we've talked about impact stories, we've talked about values/identity, and then finally, we have what we call turning point stories. So for example, like I would say, the moment you realize that an issue was an issue. So there are some organizers that I've worked with on environmental justice. Their story was like a turning point during a class or something, that they learned something that kind of led them to doing more research, more advocacy, or someone attended a webinar and learned something. Even attending something like this can feel like a turning point, right? So just think about when you had that moment of realizing you cared about an issue, realizing that an issue was important. Maybe it's something you witnessed or observed. So those are the three types of story. Your story is yours. It will always be a good story. So you don't have to try and force it into one of these three. Think about these more as guide points for you all to start framing, why do I care about an issue? Because that is a really effective tool that you will need to do your lobbying at QPPI. And with that, I will hand it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Larissa. So in a little bit, we will break you all into small groups, in where you're going to be discussing what are the elements of your story that you want the lobbyist, your member of Congress to walk away with. What are some of the elements in your story that you want to highlight? And it doesn't have to be detailed, but maybe start laying out what you want your story to entail and how you're going to tie the legislative ask into your story. So again, it doesn't have to be perfect. I think that if you come up with a layout, that could be a good starting point. And you still have time to really start thinking about what do I want to share about myself, whether that's like Larissa mentioned, laying out the story, telling elements. Is it an impact story? Is it a value/identity story? Or is it a turning point story? So really start thinking about what kind of story you want to tell your member of Congress. And before we do that, I'm sure Larissa's working in the back end and trying to give you all, you're ready? Okay, perfect. So we will give you about 10 minutes and then we will bring you back and we will share what you came up with and we will